couple classes. And we're going to talk about today in the text, mostly the Jewish biblical texts, a couple other texts assisting us as well, what it is that a prophet is doing. So not like day to day, not like what is their schedule, when do they eat breakfast, but like in the global scheme of why we find the prophet's work and words so important. Let's take a look at some specifics. And so today and also next week, we're going to be looking at two sort of complementary functions of the prophet. And the one we're going to be looking at today is probably the more well-known of the two. And it's challenging the powerful. That's one of the things that prophets do habitually, is challenge those who have power. And I didn't prepare a slide that sort of defines power, but I want to be kind of really clear what I mean about that, because I feel like everyone I have ever baggage around the word power. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, which are truisms, but at the same time, every person has some degree of power. And power can be granted institutionally. So like if you are the CEO, you have a certain amount of given power based on your role. If you have a lot of wealth, you have a certain amount of power that's accumulated by that wealth. But if a group of people, any group of any people, have power just by the amount of people who are in their group. And so I don't want to define power as a negative in all cases. I think we need to, wrestle with power and the power that we have with other people and also the power we have over other people. I would venture to say that most people who have ever met other people in their lives, there is a power dynamic there. It's very rare where you have two totally equal people on exactly equal footing in every single issue. Like even your life partner is probably going to have more power in certain situations and less power in other situations. And whether that's your romantic life partner or a professional partner or somewhere else where you're theoretically equal, you're not always equal in every situation. And that's something to keep in mind as well when we're talking about the power dynamics of the role of the prophet. And here, what I'm going to be mostly focusing on are people and groups with institutional power. Usually the prophets are talking to people who have the formal authority. A lot of kings and queens, monarch type people, but it's also a lot of groups of people who have institutional power and authority, who make decisions, who give rulings, who issue decrees, who speak on behalf of other groups or people. And so the prophets' interactions with them become very, very countercultural, because normally if a person has higher authority, they're the ones who make the rules. And then other people listen to them, or theoretically listen to them. We can talk all about children and parent power dynamics and how listening to your parents always works. But for purposes of this discussion, that's generally the societal structure we're dealing with. It's a top-down power structure. If you're here and I'm here, then you listen to what I say. And sometimes that gets reversed. So without too much further ado, let me kind of share my screen. We're going to do a little bit of review, as I said, and then we'll connect all together. All right. So there we go. When we've been talking about the prophets, we've been talking about this definition we got of prophecy from Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, who was the former British chief rabbi of blessed memory. And he sort of said this phrase throughout his piece, but I keep coming back to it. A prophet does not warn, he foretells. A prophet does not predict a future catastrophe, but rather does not speak to predict a future catastrophe, but rather to avert it. So this is the framework we're going to. The reason a prophet speaks is not to predict a future catastrophe necessarily, but to try and avert it. And we're going to see that kind of played with a little bit here when we look at a couple of specific prophets. So again, before I was talking about speaking truth to power. And just to get a sense, either physically with your actual hand or with the little raise hand icon, how many of you have heard this phrase, speak truth to power? All right, so I see most of you have a hands raised or a thumbs up. It's a very popular phrase, but I did not know where this phrase came from. I had no idea, so I looked it up, and I found a bunch of different online and book. Yes, I actually have book reference books, and they talked about the origin of this phrase, and it turns out it was actually made in a pamphlet first by a group of Quaker justice advocates in the 1940s. Primarily, this one man, Baynard Rustin, who's an African-American Quaker, and a whole group of them were becoming involved with the civil rights movement, and eventually would go on to like be part of the leadership of groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference or the SCLC, and do work with the Freedom Rides and the Poor People's Campaign and all of these like seminal civil rights justice initiatives. But what he was talking about in this pamphlet was the average common person telling their truth to those who had power over them, to try and make either those who were not conscious of the injustices they were perpetrating aware of them, or more likely, the ones who were actively ignoring the injustices they were perpetuating be held accountable for them. And if you think about the context of religious minorities and also ethnic minorities in the 1940s speaking truth to power, this is not a theoretical exercise. This is a dangerous proposition. This is putting your life on the line to say something true about justice to someone who actively wants to do the opposite. And we saw that time and time again in the civil rights movement of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But we've seen it throughout history. And so I want to take a look in our Jewish text, specifically the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible text, at some prophets and how they were using their own speech to speak truth to power. So again, we have this list of 55 recorded prophets. We're going to take a look today at two specific prophets. You may be familiar with them, you may not. You don't need to have a lot of previous familiarity with them, but they're two very important prophets whose interactions with people in power are sort of like the standard. They're the ones that really jump out at you as being very powerful and very kind of surprising in a lot of ways. So the first one is the prophet Nathan, or Natan. He's number 12 down towards the bottom of your screen. And the second is the prophet Elijah, or Eliyahu. Elijah gets talked about quite a bit more than the prophet Nathan. And a lot of that has to do both with his life. He had a kind of very interesting span of life and was not only accorded with a lot of interactions with powerful people, but he started to produce miracles, and a lot of the miracles that Elijah does go on to be some of the miracles that Jesus does in the New Testament, sort of like a template for a person with a divine connection. But that's a subject for another discussion. So we're going to take a look at the prophet Nathan and the prophet Elijah, who were about several generations, 100, 150 years apart from each other. So who is this prophet Nathan? The prophet Nathan, or Natan, was living in mostly the time of King David, a little bit in the rule of his son, King Solomon. King David was the second of the Israelite kings. The very first was a king called Saul, or Shaul. And so Nathan lived approximately around 1000 before the Common Era. And one of the things, besides being kind of the primary role as the prophetic advisor to the king, which if you look at the Jewish texts, a lot of their monarchs had like a main prophet who was the one who talked to them. And sometimes it was someone that they select, like God spoke to the king and said, this person is your prophet. And they kind of had a formal court role like Nathan does. Other times, it's an adversarial role, which we will see very much of in the time of Elijah, that he's not sitting at the court, eating with the king and like giving him advice. He is way on the outside fighting against the king in a lot of what the king wants to do, which unfortunately in the history of kings tends to be not such just or ethical things. But one of the things that the prophet Nathan is like famously known for is that in the Babylonian Talmud, which is one of the first kind of formal collections of Jewish law, there's this series of stories about the prophet Nathan being the one who finishes writing the book of Samuel. Book of Samuel is an interesting book. It is named for the prophet Samuel, but Samuel dies well before the end of the 2 books of Samuel. And he doesn't even make it to the 2nd book of Samuel. So it's very confusing because obviously he was not writing down all the events that happened after his own death. So the Talmud says, well, the prophet Nathan, or the prophet Natan, who knew all of these events, who was the next successor in this line, finished writing the book of Samuel. And most of what this prophet, most of where he appears is in the book of Kings, which is where you get a lot of King David and King Solomon's story. So let's take a look at some of his story. So King David was and is really kind of the standard bearer for what Jewish monarchs should be. He was generally looked upon as kind of like a faithful king, that he was very devout in his observance, that he was connected to God in lots of profound ways. He was a fairly successful king in terms of his rule. The kingdom of Israel prospered. He won a lot of wars, primarily against the Philistines, but against others as well. And so his career as a king was generally considered pretty prolific. But he was not perfect. Obviously, he was not perfect. He was a human being. And so one of the things that comes about a few times is David really wants to build a house for God, to build a permanent temple that can hold the ark that has been kind of moved from place to place during the Jewish people's wandering, and make it kind of magnificent and glorious. One of the reasons this makes sense for David is that David is the first king to really establish a ruling city. So he's living in Jerusalem, but even within what is considered the borders of Jerusalem, he builds his own kind of king city, which is still known today as the city of David. You can go visit it if you go to Jerusalem. It's a small little enclave near the old city of Jerusalem. And so he had been building all these other things, and it kind of logically makes sense. I'm this great, successful king. I've been building up the city of Jerusalem as like the capital of the Jewish people. It's logical that I should build a dwelling place for God, a place where people could come on these pilgrimage holidays to celebrate, on Pesach and Shavuot and Sukkot, that everyone can come together at a central place and all worship together. And so he's thinking about doing that. And here's kind of what it says. When the king was settled in his palace, the Lord granted him safety from all his enemies around him. So this is this time of relative peace. He's not fighting active wars. The king said to the prophet Nathan, "Here I am dwelling in a house of cedar while the ark of the Lord abides in a tent." Nathan says to the king, "Go, do whatever you have in mind, for the Lord is with you." Totally logical response, as we have just said. But the plot thickens. That same night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. "Go and say to my servant David, thus says the Lord, are you the one to build a house for me to dwell in? From the day I brought the people Israel out of Egypt to this day, I have not dwelt in a house, but have moved about in a tent and tabernacle. As I moved wherever the Israelites went, did I ever reproach any of the tribal leaders whom I appointed to take care of my people, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar?" So here God's saying, look, it's been a few hundred years of me moving about from place to place. I never told you to build me a temple, so don't presume you know what's best. So that's the first admonishment. Further say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from flowering the flock. That is what David did as a younger man. He was a shepherd, to be the ruler of my people Israel. And I've been with you wherever you went. I've cut down all of your enemies before you. Moreover, I gave you great renown, like that of the greatest men on earth. I will establish a home for my people in Israel, and will plant them firm, so that they will dwell secure and tremble no more. Evil men shall not oppress them anymore, as in the past, ever since I appointed chieftains over my people. I will give you safety from your enemies. The Lord declares that to you that the Lord will establish a house for you. When your days are gone and you shall lie with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, one of your own issue, so a child of yours, and will establish his kingship. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish a royal throne forever. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. When he does wrong, I will chastise him with the rod of men and the affliction of mortals, but I will never withdraw my favor from him, as I once withdrew it from Saul, whom I removed to make room for you. Your house and your kingship shall ever be secure before you, your throne established forever. Nathan spoke to David in accordance with all these words of prophecy. So that was a long speech. But basically what God is saying here is, look, I know your fervent dreams to build this magnificent and glorious temple, but let me explain to you. I, God, am the one who's going to establish your people. You don't need to worry about your legacy. That's going to be intact. Your whole line after you of future kings is all going to be connected to you. One of your sons will continue being king. You don't have to worry about that if that's your concern. Furthermore, you don't have to worry about currying favor with me. You've already got my favor. So that's thing number 2. Don't worry about that. So what God is saying back to David is, I see why you would want to build me a temple, but you can't do it. He even specifically says, your son will be the one to build a temple. And we know that's true. David's son Solomon, who becomes king after him, builds the first temple in Jerusalem. And there's a lot of rabbinic midrash around why this is, specifically connected to this text, that it's only when David is at rest from war, which is rare, he's fighting wars for most of his kingship, that he thinks about building. And so because of that, because his hands are so tied up in war, the rabbinic midrash goes, should hands bloodied with the blood of war be at work building the sacred space for God? Which is kind of a valid rhetorical point, that David is not an evil king, not a cruel king, but certainly a king who has spent most of his time fighting off enemies and engaging in war successfully. But a person who is, kind of feeding into war is not generally the person you want to be building houses of peace. It's really hard for that to be the same person. Especially just symbolically. This is not just a practical place for people to come to worship, it's a symbol. Even today, when people, especially Jewish people, go to Jerusalem, one of the places that is common to stop to visit is the Kotel, this western retaining wall, which is actually from the second temple that was built by King Herod. But the reason that's a sacred site is because this temple was a central symbolic worship space for a long time for the Jewish people. And for David, this kind of warring king, to have built that kind of sends the wrong message. It's not exactly the space you want to create. Tony chimes in, your throne shall establish forever. One sign of a false prophet is that the prophecy is always fulfilled. David's throne is not with us now. How the commentaries explains. So it's not that one sign of a false prophet is that the prophet is always fulfilled. You'll see that there are plenty of prophets who make prophecies that are then fulfilled. But the goal of the prophet is not to have the prophecy be fulfilled. The goal of the prophet is to tell you what's going to happen so that you, the person who hears it, will change that. We're going to see in just a second, Elijah makes a bunch of dire prophecies that then come true, and it's kind of seen as a failure. That if the hearer, in this case the king, had heard Elijah's prophecies and changed his ways, the prophecy wouldn't have come true, and that would have been a success. So it's not that a false prophet makes prophecies come true and a true prophet makes the prophecies not come true. That's overly simplifying a little bit. But the idea of David's throne being forever is actually a pretty strong thread throughout the rabbinic commentaries. It's not saying that there will be a king forever. I got to be clear about that. What God's saying here today is that there will be no other line of kings, that there won't be some other house. Like if you think about the British kings, there were many different houses. There's the House of Windsor, and there's lots of other British houses that had royal lines. Here he's saying, you don't have to worry about the thing that happened to Saul happening to you. Saul was deposed as king, and his sons did not become king after him. Instead, David became king, who was from a totally different, not only different family, a totally different tribe of the Jewish people. So it's not saying that there will always be a king. What it's saying is, when we have a king, it will always be from the line of David. So much so that when we talk about messianism in the future, or the sort of God sending a messenger to usher in sort of an era of peace and unity and kind of like remaking the world, that person has to be from the line of David, which is why you see in the New Testament that there's a very large effort to connect the lineage of Jesus back to the kingdom of David, because there is this idea that there cannot be a Messiah coming from anywhere else but the house of David. Hopefully that answered some of the question. But here, imagine you're David. Imagine you are a king, you're very successful, you're uniting this country, you're fending off enemies, you're doing a fairly good job. You want to do this great thing to build a temple for God. You tell this to the prophet. The prophet comes back and says, no, God says no thanks. God says, no, you can't do it. Not only God doesn't want you to do it, but you are not going to be allowed to do it. Who tells the king they're not allowed to do stuff? Nobody. That's the answer. And the famous words of Mel Brooks, it's good to be the king. Like, that is the model in the ancient world. The king is the ultimate of ultimate authorities when concerning the people on earth. Now, in terms of the biblical kings, there's a lot that God says and does, and it's clear to any reader of the Jewish Bible that you shouldn't for a second assume the king is the ultimate authority. God is the ultimate authority. But in terms of your day-to-day life, you don't hear from God a lot if you're an average Joe. You hear from the king a lot more. The king issues edicts. The king makes proclamations. The king does all kinds of lawmaking, and generally is not interfered with by God unless they stray over the line. So for a king to say, I want to do something really great, and that he does. He honestly wants to do something really great. He wants to build this temple for people to worship that's glorious, that's a fitting house for God. It's not a bad thing he wants to do, and God says no. No, you can't do it. And an understandable reaction, at least in context of the time, would be to kill the messenger. Would be, don't tell me I can't do it, off with your head, and I'm going to build it anyway. But that's not what happens. What happens? Nothing. Nothing happens. David doesn't build the temple. He doesn't yell or scream at Nathan. He hears what he has to say, and that's the end of it. That's amazing. I don't know how many of you have ever dealt with kings. I have never had the occasion to have to bring bad news to a king or queen or president or monarch or CEO or any sort of like authority figure over me. But if you've ever been in that situation, it's not fun. Like when I was researching even just for this 4-part class, I was looking up speaking truth to power. And I would say 90% of the articles I looked at online were about doing this in a corporate setting, about creating a culture where people who had less structural authority could say the truth to their superiors. And it was fascinating to look at. Every single one said, there are plenty of leaders and CEOs who think they are open and approachable and are obviously not. Because even if you are a nice and caring person, the fact that you could fire me at any time does not make you approachable. It is very hard to say true things to someone who holds your fate in their hands. And that is no more true than when you're speaking to someone like a king in the ancient world. By the way, that's the reason we have a phrase like, don't kill the messenger, because that's something that happened a lot. Like, the messenger was frequently killed when bringing not just bad news, but any news the king didn't feel like hearing at that point. And so for a king like David, who is universally, by this point in his kingship, universally accepted, well-loved, very successful, to hear something he doesn't want to hear and to internalize and understand it, to abide by it, and to not kind of lash out in the way that kings were known to, is pretty incredible. And part of the kind of lesson that the rabbis take away from this is both Nathan was a pretty good prophet because he understood what David wanted, but he also understood what God was asking for, and kind of balanced those two in his discussion with his conversation with David. But also that David was a really good king because he didn't do everything he wanted to do and could have. I mean, like, no person would have stopped him. Theoretically, God would have stopped him. But we see in later kings, the kings who are considered bad, who are considered unjust or cruel kings, are the ones who just are capricious, who do what they want when they want, and don't follow these, like, either the general rules set out for people and kings or the specific rules that they get from prophets and God. And here David notes what he's being told and seems to understand it, at least as far as the rabbinic commentators go. Yeah. Tony makes a good point. In later kings, a lot of the kings who don't listen to those messages often speedily lose their kingdoms. That's absolutely true. If you look later on in Tanakh, in like second book of Kings and beyond, these kings who are doing bad things and get warnings and don't heed them often lose their kingdoms very quickly. That's a fantastic point. But as I said, David is not a perfect king. David is not only merely human, but I would venture to say that he is uniquely flawed. And we see this, by the way, throughout Tanakh. Someday, when I have vast amounts of free time, one of the things I talk about is I would love to write a book about the flaws of biblical characters, because it seems like the greater the person, like the greater their esteem, the greater their impact on Jewish life and history, the more glaring their flaws are. They're just in such stark relief. My favorite example is Moses. So hopefully some of you have heard of Moses. He was kind of a big deal. Moses, throughout the Jewish tradition, not just in the Jewish Bible, but in the rabbinic tradition, in the history of Jewish people, is kind of looked upon as this just immense figure. He's often called Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, like the one who taught us everything, the one who gave us all the laws, the one who kind of took these random tribes and families and turned them into a people, into a nation. And that's true. That's accurate to credit him with all those things. But the first time we see Moses as an adult person acting in the world, he encounters a slave being beaten by an Egyptian taskmaster and murders the taskmaster. And while there's plenty of beautiful midrashim and commentaries that talk about this, saying like Moses had this instinct to justice, he finds a stranger who he doesn't know who's a slave and sticks up for the slave, he still murdered somebody. Like, that can't be glossed over. He still stepped in and murdered a person, and that's the first thing we hear about him. That's amazing to me, because there are plenty of chronicles, especially like mythologies and sacred texts, that talk about their heroes as just superhuman, larger than life, more perfect, more strong, more wise, just infallible. But if you look at just anywhere in the Jewish Bible, the main characters are just riddled with flaws. And I think that's on purpose. I think that the text puts the flaws there, like doesn't leave them out, because if you're reading this text about how to live an ethical life and just everyone in the text who's being your example is perfect, it's not relatable. But if King David, who does amazing things, also does these terrible things that you would never ever do, it makes them a more understandable person. It makes their accomplishments seem more accessible, and it makes kind of the ethics that make up the tradition a little bit more balanced. Do we know the worth of... So Moses didn't speak words that ended in death. He actually killed the Egyptian taskmaster with his fists. It says the Egyptian taskmaster was beating the slave, and Moses stepped in and killed him. He didn't say anything. He just killed him. Rashi has lots of commentary and talks a great game. But if you just read the Stam text, he kills him. Now, do we know whether he was attempting to kill him? No, we don't. It could have been he was trying to stand in the way and he tripped over a pebble and he hit his head and died. Totally possible read. But either way, he's still liable, whether it's liable for first-degree murder or reckless endangerment homicide. I don't know legal categories, but yeah, it's kind of besides the point. But we're going to take a look at David here and his kind of most obvious, most glaring, flawed episode. If the screen will change. There we go. So the most famous giant mistake that David made is the episode with Bathsheba, or Bathsheba, if you're reading it more English. So just the quick summary of that story. David is hanging out in the palace. He looks out his window and he sees a beautiful woman bathing on her roof, like you do. And he thinks, I must have her. So he invites her to the palace and sleeps with her. Turns out that she's married. Darn, should have seen that one coming. So David does what everyone would do. He recalls the husband who's fighting in one of David's wars, who's a soldier, and invites him to go back home and spend the night with his wife, so that if he sleeps with his wife, then everyone will think that this child born from wedlock is the husband's. He doesn't do that and says, how can I go home in comfort with my wife when all the other troops are, in the soldiers' encampments, preparing for battle? So David says, well, that didn't work. So he sends him back off to war and tells the general, put Uriah, which is the husband's name, put him at the front of the battle. And sure enough, the husband gets killed in battle because he's on the front lines. And a message comes back to David that Uriah gets killed, and he says, I'm very sad about this. This is a tragedy. Thank you for telling me. Which is just gross. It's just, the wording is very not helpful and emotionally pleasant. So here's where we pick up. We get word of it, and people appropriately mourn. Traditionally in Jewish life, there's, the first 7 days after someone is buried is called Shiva, and then the first 30 days is called Shloshim. This is a formal mourning period. So after that formal mourning period is over, it doesn't say exactly if it's like the day the mourning period is over or just sometime later, not specific, but sometime after the mourning period was over for Uriah, David sent and had Bathsheba brought to his palace, and she became his wife and bore him a son. So not awesome. There's kind of, I don't know if you could technically say that David murdered Uriah, but he basically did. He arranged the situation for him to easily die after having an adulterous relationship with his wife. So that's not bad. That's ethically horrible. And so we get, as soon as this episode concludes, the first thing we hear is, but the Lord was displeased at what David has done, obviously. And so God sent Nathan to David. And here's what Nathan does. It's a famous parable, and I love it. It's one of my favorite pieces of text. So Nathan came to him and said, here's what's going on. He presents it not as a parable, but here, you're the king, you make rulings. Make a ruling on this situation. There were two men in the same city, one rich and one poor. The rich man had very large flocks and herds, but the poor man had only one little ewe lamb that he had bought. He tended it, and it grew up together with him and his children. He used to share his morsels of bread and drink from his cup and nestle it to his bosom. It was like a daughter to him. One day, a traveler came to the rich man, but he was loath to take anything from his own flocks or herds to prepare a meal for the guest who had come to him. So he took the poor man's lamb, slaughtered it, and prepared it for the man who had come to him. David flew into a rage at the man and said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who did this, meaning the rich man, deserves to die. He shall pay for the lamb 4 times over because such a thing he did and showed no pity. And Nathan says to David, that man is you. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, it was I who anointed you king over Israel, and it was I who rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and the possession of your master's wives, and I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that was not enough, I would have given you twice as much more. Why then have you flouted the command of the Lord and done what displeases God? You have put Uriah the Hittite to the sword. You took his wife and made her your wife and had him killed by the sword of the Ammonites. Therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you spurned me by taking the wife of Uriah the Hittite and making her your wife. Thus says the Lord, I will make a calamity rise against you from within your own house. I will take your wives and give them to another man before your very eyes, and he shall sleep with your wives under this very sun. By the way, this does happen, and the other man is one of David's own children. It's a horrible episode, leads to lots more bloodshed. You acted in secret, but I will make this happen in the sight of all Israel in broad daylight. This is also a calamity in David's later life, that his one particular of his sons, but several of his sons kind of rebel against him and sleep with his wives and raise up armies against David's armies and kind of try to usurp the throne before David dies. And this ends in horrible conflict and the splitting up of families. And eventually his son Solomon does take over the throne, but there's a lot of conflict. Solomon obviously here is, this is the son that's just being born to Bathsheba, is not the oldest son, although the Jewish Bible has a long and storied tradition of the oldest son not inheriting the way they're supposed to. In fact, never does the oldest son inherit the way they're technically supposed to, according to ancient custom. I cannot think of a single example, which is fascinating, but that's the assumption that the text goes on, that the oldest son should inherit, and then it keeps flouting that assumption every single time. And here's the rub. David says to Nathan, I stand guilty before the Lord. And Nathan replied to David, the Lord has remitted your sin. You shall not die. However, since you have spurned the enemies of the Lord by this deed, even the child about to be born to you shall die. So that is an incredible piece of text. First of all, the parable he uses is amazing. The parable that Nathan uses is so subtle because he presents it like, here is a case for you to rule on. Tell me what's the correct judgment. And that's what kings did a lot. They did a lot of people who present cases before him. Maybe there's two parties arguing over a piece of land. Maybe there's some other claim that's being made. But they often went to the king and he would settle disputes. So it's totally within David's wheelhouse to talk about this subject. He is primed to look at this kind of in a detached and theoretically justice-oriented way. So he's already got justice on his mind. And the reaction that David draws from the story that Nathan tells him is the exact reaction that Nathan wants. It's precisely what he wants David to feel. He looks at the story and says, how can someone who has so much take this man's only special prized thing in his life? Why couldn't he be happy with what he had? Why couldn't he just live his life in that kind of comfort? And when Nathan says, you are the man, it's like a ton of bricks on David. It's like, oh my God, I did exactly that. I couldn't stop myself from taking Uriah's one prized thing he had in his life. And it's just like the floor is giving out under him. And that's exactly the reaction that Nathan wants, because he could have said, look, God knows what you did with Bathsheba. Everybody knows. We're not stupid. You're going to be in trouble. And that would have sent the message. But the way he does it here is it's a way of speaking this truth that David desperately doesn't want to acknowledge. He tried to cover it up. He tried to make everything seem above board. He tries to kind of really conceal his adulterous, connection in any way he can. And so when Nathan comes and shows him a like example of injustice, he gets David to feel the thing that Uriah would have felt. He gets him to feel where those gaps in justice are, not just intellectually understand it. Because David intellectually understands what he did. He's not stupid. He knows he did something wrong. But like so many people, especially I would say those with the means to cover things up, the reaction to doing things bad is to cover them up. I have a friend. It's been my friend since we were about 9. I don't know that he's ever admitted to me to being wrong about anything ever. Like even factual things that you can look up online. He just like is incapable of saying like, you're right, I was wrong. I've never, and part of it is just like his personality of like giving grief about stuff. But part of it is like to admit you're wrong is hard and it's embarrassing. And if you do that, for at least in some people's eyes, or I would say in like a psychological sense, you're diminishing yourself by acknowledging something, even though you've already done that thing. And I understand that too for myself. I hate it when I say something that's just wrong, or like I make a mistake like that and someone calls me on it. It makes me feel just so dumb. Like, how could I have mixed those two things up? Like, it's not a big deal. We all like get things confused or, reference the wrong thing or, mix up people's names. But like, it just feels, it feels so awful to make those kinds of mistakes. And that's little stuff. That's, getting someone's name wrong or, saying something appeared in the Mishnah when it was actually the Talmud or whatever. Like, that's not adultery and murder. Like, to own up to something like that is a huge emotional ask. But Nathan kind of forces it through. And because of who Nathan is, both his relationship with God, but also his relationship with David, he gets the reaction he wants. He gets David's admission of guilt. I want to shift gears a little and talk about Elijah with the last little bit of time we have left. We spent a lot of time on Nathan because Nathan does a really good job. But I want to also kind of touch on Elijah too, because his interactions are fairly impactful. So Elijah is very different than Nathan. He was not, appointed as a king's advisor. He does not sit in court. He is the adversary of the kings that he lives under. So he's a little more than a century after Nathan, and he appears primarily in the Book of Kings, a little bit at the end of the first Book of Kings, mostly second Book of Kings. And he has these battles, both verbal and literally sword battles with King Ahab. And there's a lot of stories about Ahab and Jezebel. They are not great, both as functional leaders, but also as moral human beings. And some of the things they do is they take, excessive taxes from their people. They worship foreign gods and practice idol worship. There's a lot of things that they do that are like very taboo. And so his big role is to be the spokesman for ethics in his generation, to be the kind of lone voice of what's good and right. And so there's a couple of things that he does. One is he confronts Ahab on numerous occasions. Here's just one. He literally goes into Ahab's court and Ahab says to him, "Is that you, troubler of Israel?" Like, he already knows. Like, you're going to say some stuff that I'm not going to want to hear because all you ever do is criticize, Elijah. And that's kind of the relationship. And Elijah comes back with a brilliant retort. "It is not I who have brought trouble on Israel, but you and your father's house by forsaking the commandments of God and going after the Baalim." So Baalim is this general term for a whole host of the pantheon, primarily of like Sumeria and a lot of the Amorite nations. But the text talks about Baal as like these polytheistic gods usually worshipped through idols. "Now summon Israel to join me at Mount Carmel, together with 450 of the prophets of Baal and 400 of the prophets of Asherah," another one of these foreign gods. So he sets up this thing. He says, "Look, enough is enough. You've got all the Israelites going and doing idol worship. So now we're going to have a test." He issues a challenge. He says, take 50 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. Take all of these prophets, and I'm going to challenge them to a prophet duel on the top of Mount Carmel. We're going to see whose prophecy is stronger, which is like an amazing thing to say because it's him against, 850 people ostensibly. And he says, bring all of Israel. We're going to do this out in public. We'll see whose God is God. It's a pretty big gauntlet to lay down. And a lot, Ahab could have just said no and off with your head, but he doesn't say that. He says, "Okay, Mr. Smarty Pants, we'll see what's going on." And here's what happens. So he goes to the prophets. Elijah says so they're out on Mount Carmel, all of these prophets and Elijah. He says to the prophets of Baal, "Choose a bull and prepare it, for you are the majority. Invoke your God by name, but don't apply fire." I'm not exactly sure why. I think the idea was that if the god Baal is the strongest, then he'd make the fire appear and consume these sacrifices with a magic heavenly fire. So they do that. They prepare it. They invoke God by name from morning until noon, shouting, "Oh, Baal, answer us!" But there was no sound. None responded. So they performed a hopping dance about the altar that had been set up. Amazing, amazing prophecy. When noon came, Elijah mocked them, saying, "Shout louder! After all, he is a god. But he may be in conversation, he may be detained, or he may be on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and will wake up." This is hilarious. This is like the best roasting I've ever seen. Like, maybe your God's a little hard of hearing, you should speak up so your very powerful God can answer you. It's like, it's such clear mocking. It's amazing. So, yeah, nothing happens. And Elijah speaks to the people, saying, "Come closer to me." And all the people came closer to him. And he repaired the damaged altar of the Lord, and he took 12 stones corresponding to the number of tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come. Israel shall be your name. And with the stones he built the altar in the name of the Lord. And around the altar he made a trench large enough for 2 seah of seed. Seah is a unit of weight. He laid out wood and cut up the bowl and laid it on the wood. And he said, "Fill 4 jars with water and pour over the burnt offering and the wood." So now he's drenching this offering in water. And he does it a second time and a third time. Water ran around. And when it's time to offer the meal offering, Elijah came forward and said, "O God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let your word be known today and answer me. I am your servant. I've done all these things at your bidding. Answer me, O Lord, that this people may know you, that you, O Lord, are God, and you've turned their heart backward." Then fire from God descended and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and the earth, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. When the people saw this, they all flung themselves on their faces and cried out, "The Lord alone is God." So clearly Elijah's prophecy magic works better than these prophets of the god Baal. So what does Elijah do? He says, "Seize all the prophets of Baal, do not let a single one of them get away." And they seized them, and Elijah took them down to the Wadi Kishon and slaughtered them there. So this is incredible. Like, this is insane. He challenges the prophets to this prophet off to see whose God is the strongest. And by the way, these are the prophets sitting at the king's table. They're eating meals with the king. The king and queen are getting all of Israel to pray to these foreign gods. And not only does he demonstrate that the creator of the universe, the one God, is the God, and that these others are idols made up by people, but he then takes them all to a stream and has them killed in front of the king, who is theoretically their benefactor. That is an incredible example of standing up to power. Of course, the king immediately sees this and says, "Seize Elijah and kill him," and he has to run away. But still, like, it's a powerful statement. And it just shows this kind of discrepancy between Elijah and other prophets, that he really has to stand up to the king, not just in words, but he has to actively stop the king from doing things that are unethical, that are, clearly against God's will. And so, like, that is a huge and powerful statement. We're running a little bit low on time, but there's hold on. There's one other thing. So later, Achav does not live forever. He eventually dies, and a new king, Ahaziah, becomes king. He has an accident. So after he becomes king, he falls through the lattice of his upper chamber and is injured. And so he instructs messengers, "Go inquire of Baal Zebub," who is another one of these gods, the god of Ekron, which is a place, "whether I should recover of this injury." So an angel of God says to the prophet Elijah, "Go and confront these messengers, saying, 'Why are you asking foreign gods for prophecy? That's just more idol worship.'" And the messengers come back to Ahaziah. He says, "Why have you come back?" And they said, "A man came toward us and said, 'Go back to the God who sent you and say to him, thus says the Lord, is there no God in Israel that you must inquire of Baal Zebub, the god of Ekron? Assuredly you shall not rise from this bed you are lying on, but shall die.' What sort of man was it," he asked them, "who came towards you and said these things?" And they said, "A hairy man with a leather belt tied around his waist." And he said, "That's Elijah," which I think is just hysterical, that just any hairy man, of course, is Elijah. But, he is known. He's like, oh, he's the one who said all the things that the last king didn't want to hear. It's got to be Elijah who's making this happen. And the king gets upset. So we were talking with David about how David sort of accepts Nathan's words and understands them and internalizes them. And even though he doesn't want to hear necessarily those messages. He understands the rightness of them. The kings that Elijah have to deal with do not at all do that. They do the exact opposite. So here, Ahaziah sends a captain with 50 men. They go to attack. It's not clear if they're going to attack, but they're going to capture Elijah and bring him to the king. Elijah keeps responding, no. And fire from heaven consumes these 50 men. And then they do it again. And the fire comes down and consumes the men. And they do it again. And more fire comes down. And he finally sends a message to the king saying, go down. Or God sends him a message saying, go down, don't be afraid of him. And he goes to the king and says, because you sent messengers to go do idol worship on your behalf, and because you tried to attack me, who's giving you actual messages from actual God, you will never arise from this bed, and you shall die in it. And it's incredible to think about what Elijah's saying here. He's saying, if you had just done what you're supposed to do, if you'd learned from your predecessor who was a terrible king doing unethical things and charted a different course, you could have been a good king. But because you didn't, because you fell into the exact same traps of using your powerful to afflict or using your power to afflict other people, your rule is going to be cut short, and you're not going to be able to do any of the things you want to. You're going to die crippled in this bed, which is what happens. It's an amazing role. So it's fine to look at these as, literary pieces. It's if nothing else, these are exciting literature. There's, fire from heaven and swords and, a hairy man with a leather belt. It's very exciting. But why are we concerned with them today? What is the message that we're supposed to be getting here? And the fact is that in our day, as in any time, there are always going to be people who are making decisions for other people. And whether we're talking about parents for children or CEOs for their company or, elected officials for their country or state or city or whatever, there are always going to be people who are making these choices that either benefit or harm the people around them. And in every generation, there are some leaders who seem to get it, who seem to really try at least to make decisions that help the people they're supposed to be serving. And there are others who don't. And what these prophets are sort of saying is that both of those leaders need that truth to be spoken to them. And what distinguishes a good leader from a bad is not that good leaders always do the right thing and never make mistakes. It's that when leaders do something that impacts their public, the people they're supposed to be serving negatively, and they're told about it, they fix it. Whereas unethical leaders don't. Unethical leaders don't hear the criticism. They shout down the critic. They, try to cover up their misdeeds with more misdeeds, which in the biblical literature ultimately usually leads to their downfall. But I think there's something really powerful here that I don't want to gloss over. And I bring to bear the words of the much lauded and amazing former senator of blessed memory, John Lewis. So several years ago, he gave this speech at the Dinkins Forum in which many notable people were speaking. And he was talking about his life. He was talking about the work he had done. This is in 2017. And one part of his speech really kind of stood out. He's talking about his memory of the March in Selma and how that shaped him and what he thought the point of doing that march was and the experiences that he went through. And so I just want to read a little snippet of that. Lewis recounted his memory of the March in Selma where he thought he was going to die. But instead, he was taken in, he said, by sisters at a nearby Catholic hospital who took care of him. Recently, he reconnected with 3 of those sisters who recognized him, and they hugged. We must never, ever forget the bridges that brought us across, he said. Using the cadences of a preacher and alternating between quiet and booming tones, Lewis said his philosophy is that when you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have a moral obligation, a mission, and a mandate to speak up, to speak out, and to get in the way. Sometimes you're called to turn things upside down, to set it right side up. For me, that is just modern prophecy in a few sentences. What Senator Lewis was doing through his life's work was habitually speaking truth to power. What he was saying as a part and a leader in the Selma March was, you cannot claim to be the land of the free and the home of the brave if you take parts of our population and say they're less human. If you don't give the same opportunities to all human beings, if you try to separate and segregate members of our society from one another. And on the surface, the words sound like truisms, like self-evident, but at this time, in his place and time, obviously we know they were not. They were controversial. And people didn't want to hear either that Black and brown people were getting the short end of the stick. They didn't want to acknowledge that things were unequal, or they didn't want to hear the words because that would mean conceding the point. That would mean giving up something they thought was theirs. And the something is usually power and access to resources. But he said it anyway because it needed to be said. He made it public because when things are kept quiet, then injustice festers. And it's such an incredible point when we look at, even in our own time, how people react to things that they don't want to hear. If you read some article that says, especially when it's talking about somebody's own experience, and they say like, this is my life, and here are the things I'm dealing with, and you read it and you say, oh, that's terrible. That's not true. That's just BS. Well, but that's somebody's lived experience. And to kind of write people off as just, insane or kooks or what do they know is harmful to our society and to people in leadership. On the same token, when people distort the truth, when people say things that are not real and claim that they are, it inverts that whole idea of speaking truth to power, and instead they're speaking lies to the public. And that too kind of feeds into this idea of the prophet, because just like later on in Elijah's kind of fighting with Ahav, with King Ahab, he says over and over again, you're telling the people that they're praying to God when they're praying to a statue. You tell the people that they're supporting the benefit of their society when in turn they're just enriching your own wealth. And so that dual idea of both criticizing actions, but also talking truth, speaking plain truth that needs to be heard by leaders and the public alike, is something that the prophet does throughout their career in the Jewish texts. So that's one kind of big piece I think we can take away today, that we as readers and livers in 2021, we don't need to wait for fire from heaven or a whispered word in our ear. That we have these texts, we have a tradition that tells us, this is what's right and wrong. And, I say to people, there's great latitude to interpret the Jewish biblical text. There's a lot of ways to read different things. But when it comes to ethics, when it comes to like moral clarity, they take some pretty stark stances. There's not a lot of mincing words in a lot of places where it says, hating your neighbor is wrong, period. Oppressing the stranger is evil, end sentence. Not sustaining the poor and the widow and the orphan is forbidden. Like, they're really clear about some of these ethical issues. Some other ones, there's a lot of gray area, but it's important to remember that, it's easy to rationalize a lot of things. I don't always drive the speed limit, even though I know that that's a speed limit, not a speed suggestion. And I rationalize it thinking, well, this is the flow of traffic, or I'm really late, or whatever. And that's a silly example. But part of what the prophet is doing is chipping away at that veneer of being able to rationalize, at putting this mirror of, stark black and white before a person who's responsible for other people. And I think that in our own understanding of, what it is to be an engaged person, that voice of the prophet really plays a huge role. So I know I didn't leave a lot of time for questions today, and I apologize. And I understand we're at 101. I don't want to be sensitive to people's time. I don't want to keep people over. If people do have a couple of questions, I'm willing to stay and answer a few more. But if not, I will say goodbye for today. Our last class is next Thursday, and we're going to be talking about kind of the inverse role of what we're talking about today. The other function of a prophet is, kind of comforting the people, is relating to not the people in power, but the rest of the people. And so we're going to see how they do that in kind of a very different way. Thank you, everybody, for your thoughtful comments. I appreciate that.
Rabbi, I had a question. Why do we welcome Elijah at the Passover Seder?
Great. So Elijah is an interesting biblical character because he had a whole nother life of influence into the Jewish works beyond his prophecy. So you'll see in the later text, he does a lot less of fighting with kings and a lot more of individual, like, solving of problems. So there's all these stories where, a woman and a man are trying to conceive and they can't do it. And they get a visit from Elijah, the prophet, who says, like, say these magic words and, feed a stranger, and all of a sudden they conceive a child. Or, somebody is, in trouble somewhere and has this horrible disease, and they magically cure the horrible disease. So he does all of these miraculous things as a prophet. And at the end of his life, there's a whole episode that appears in the second book of Kings where he doesn't die. He ascends to heaven on a fiery chariot. And he becomes this mythical figure throughout rabbinic literature where he just shows up, usually in disguise, to sort of ways sort of stand for justice. And so we invite him in at the Pesach Seder because that's of all the holidays the Jewish people celebrate, Pesach is the one most concerned with justice. That's really what the whole Exodus story is about. That's really what we talk about. It's, from slavery to freedom, it's, righting wrongs. And so we invite Elijah in because he is just the rabbinic poster child for righting wrongs. He is the one who speaks most for justice. And also there's this whole idea, this mystical idea that he never died, that he is like eternal, that he visits people in every generation. So we hope he visits us, tests us, and finds that we are just people. That would be great to have a, stamp from on high saying, you are a moral good person. You did everything you're supposed to do. Way to go. Here's a cookie. Like, that would be great. So there is this whole interweaving of Elijah's mysticism with the sort of Torah's theme on Pesach of freedom and justice. It's a great question, Harvey.
One other question, and maybe you can answer it next week because I have to leave. Under your definition of prophet, why wouldn't Jesus be considered a prophet?
Great question. Because the Christians co-opted him. That's the short answer. He lived several thousand years after the Jewish tradition kind of closes its formal written text tradition of the Bible. So he was not there at the time when we were naming prophets. And that's kind of the truth, is that, the 400 years after Jesus, the church is formed. And once they claim that he's the Son of God, he's no longer Jewish in their eyes or in the Jewish tradition's eyes. Like, he is the poster board for Christianity. Like, you can't really have him be a Jewish prophet at the same time.
Right, but even though we don't regard him as the Messiah or the Son of God, if some of the reports about him are accurate, wouldn't he fill the qualifications of a prophet?
So, I mean, that's a good, interesting question. And I'm not sure that I have a good answer, because technically no, because we stopped naming prophets at a certain point in history. Like, there was a point that we stopped, and then several thousand years passed, and then there was Jesus. But I will definitely say that the Christian writings about Jesus are based very heavily on the prophets of what they consider the Old Testament. So like I said, the miracles that Jesus performs are straight out of Elijah and he had a kind of second in command whose name is Elisha. A lot of the miracles they do are exactly one for one the miracles that Jesus does. And there's a huge attempt to connect him to the Davidic line, to the line of King David, and to connect his history to the history of Jewish leaders, because that's what the people who lived at the time of Jesus were familiar with. So there's a giant attempt to make Christianity the next iteration of Judaism, which is what the Christian church kind of sold itself as at its inception, that Judaism was great. Now we've got Judaism 2.0, so forget Judaism and be Christian. And they were very upset when a lot of the Jewish community didn't do that, when they kept being Jewish. And that caused a huge rift for 1,500 years-ish. Really almost until Pope John Paul II gave the Vatican II doctrine, the Nostra Aetate, that really said, no, Jews are not actually evil Christ killers. They're just humans who are brothers and sisters who are not Christian, which sounds very logical and yet took a long time to get there.
Thank you
Awesome
very much.
question. Thank you so much, Harvey.
Thank you.
Other
Rabbi.
questions?
I think that might be it for today.
Very good.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.